The Rambam's choice of words is always very precise, so that makes you wonder why he calls the laws of the Beis Hamikdash Hilchos Beis HaBechira, not Hilchos Beis Hamikdash, especially considering that the other subsequent halachas he does refer to it as the Beis Hamikdash. The Rambam wants us to know something about the nature of the Beis Hamikdash, how Hashem chose not only the location, as he did in the Mishkan Shiloh, but actually chose the building itself to be a special place. That tells us a difference between how korbanos are brought in the Beis Hamikdash versus Mishkan Shiloh, and why it is that after Mishkan Shiloh, there was still the possibility of bringing a korban on a bama, a personal altar. That's all in this week's parasha. The responsibility, the mitzvah, to only bring a korban in the Beis Hamikdash, and therefore, subsequently, in the Miser HaKrova Michutz HaMikdash, the prohibition against bringing a korban outside of the Beis Hamikdash, was Retzach beParasha Seinu, is mentioned in our parasha. The Mishnah in Zvachim tells us the following details. This was an historical process that happened in stages. When the Mishkan was in the desert, you were not allowed to have a private bama anywhere else. Bo'le Gilgal, when they came into Eretz Yisrael and they set up the oil moed in Gilgal, then Hutra Abamis, they were allowed to have private altars again. Bo'le Shiloh, when they built the Mishkan in Shiloh, Nesru Habamis, they were not permitted to have bamis during that period. Then he describes what that Mishkan was like. It was a stone structure without a proper roof. That is what is referred to in the pasuk when it says you will come to the place of rest. After 369 years, when Mishkan Shiloh was destroyed, then Bo'el Noiv and Givon, they had a Mishkan in two places over the course of 57 years, Noiv and Givon, and during that time, Hutru Habamos, it was permitted again to bring a korban on a private altar. But eventually, Bo'el Yerushalayim, Nesru Habamos, after the Yidden built the Beis Hamikdash in Yerushalayim, they were never permitted again to have bamos. There was never again going to be the opportunity for bamos. That's what the pasuk refers to when it says you will come to the place of inheritance. So this is moving with the Shena Mishnah. So you can understand from this Mishnah is the union from Bo'el Shiloh Nesra HaBamos, the fact that when they came to Mishkan Shiloh, they were no longer allowed to bring bamos. There's a reason for that. Is verbunden damit, was dort ist given Abese avoni vi hoise menuchot. It would sound from the mission that that's because it was a permanent structure as opposed to the other places that was a tent. Mashenken be Gilgal ifnei zeh was damit hot men aufgestellt im oil moed. Right, Gilgal before that was still the oil moed, which was a temporary structure. Aber the Lashon Rambam nikra Shiloh Bayis. The Rambam actually tells us Shiloh is the first place that is called a house for Hashem. Therefore, it has permanence. That's why you can't have bamos at that time. So, in that case, we have to understand. There's a pasuk in Shmuel Beis that tells us, Ki lo yoshavti bi babayis, that the Eibishter says, I never settled in a home. From the time I took the Yidden out of Mitzrayim, until the time of the Beis Hamikdash, and in between, the Eibishter was, so to speak, in transit in places that were temporary, an oil and a Mishkan. Das heißt, so that pasuk implies, as the Mishkan Shiloh wird nicht gerechnet für Abayis, no blois als oil or the Mishkan. That implies that Shiloh does not have the status of a bias of a true home. Why then is it that the Rambam calls it a bias and it is forbidden to have bamos during that time? So the easiest way to answer is it's all relative. Bepashas kemen sagen. As es wenn sich legabe was miret depends what you're referring to. Legabe dem Mishkan, if I'm making a comparison to the Mishkan in the desert, Shiloh gerechnet als bias. Compared to that, Shiloh was much more permanent. It was a stone structure. It is considered a home. Mashenken gabe de Beis Hamikdash b'Yerushalayim is a splois and oil. But compared to the ultimate home, the Beis Hamikdash in Yerushalayim, Shiloh is temporary and therefore called a tent. Okay, that's a nice explanation. However, we're talking over here about halacha. Aber von dem, was man verbindet das mit der Din Mesuyam, the fact that the description of Shiloh as a house is linked to a practical halacha that you may not bring a korban on a bama while that house is standing, Iser Habamis, is mashma zoiche Mishkan Shiloh is for an ageder fun bias. That implies that Mishkan Shiloh is qualified or classified as a house, which is why it is the place, so to speak, of the rest of the Shechina. So we need to understand what exactly is the status of Shiloh. So let's explain as follows. We'll find that there's a single expression that is used to refer both to Mishkan Shiloh and to Yerushalayim. What is that expression? The pasuk says you should bring a korban to the place that Hashem has chosen. State in Sifri. The Sifri explains to mean Zoi Shiloh or Beis Zolamim. The same expression refers both to Shiloh and to the Beis Hamikdash. Therefore, they are very similar in spite of their practical differences, one being temporary and the other permanent. We do not have that expression, a place that Hashem had chosen in reference to any of the Mishkanos that preceded it. Not even the so-called more permanent structures that were built in Noiv and Givon. So there's something unique about Shiloh and the Beis Hamikdash. They are both chosen places. We're going to explore the difference between how they are chosen and what they are chosen for. So there's a clear and obvious difference between them. As long as the Mishkan was in the desert, yes, the Mishkan was in the desert and you were not allowed to have a private altar, but that's obviously very different to Mishkan Shiloh and to the Beis Hamikdash for obvious reasons. Practically, you could only bring a korban in the Mishkan, but nobody would suggest that the location of the Mishkan was a location chosen by Hashem, because it didn't have a single location. The Mishkan was constantly in transit. So therefore, it's obvious that it's not the place Hashem chose. Likewise, the 14 years when the Jewish people were conquering and dividing Eretz Yisrael, you also can't say now there's a place that was chosen for Hashem. But the Mishkan is given in Gilgal, when the Mishkan at that time was in Gilgal, you can't say that's the place. It's definitely temporary because we're just setting up shop. But we don't yet have the principle of encampments of the Jewish people as you had in the desert, Mishkan, the Machne Shechina, then the Machne Leviah, and Machne Yisrael. So that obviously can't be the case. You obviously can't call that the place Hashem had chosen. Mashenken b'Shiloh bat, when they arrive in Shiloh, now we are referring to a place Hashem had designated. Here is a stone structure in a permanent place for 369 years. That is permanent, much more than anything that preceded it. So if this is the place Hashem has chosen, naturally you are forbidden to bring a korban anywhere that's not the place that Hashem has chosen. That's why the structure had to be stone, a more permanent type of structure, which the Rambam calls a house. Because the theme of Mishkan Shiloh is permanence. This is real. This is established. It's a place Hashem has chosen. On Now that we know that distinction, that Shiloh is a place of permanence, it is a place that Hashem has selected as the house for the Shekhinah as compared to Noiv and Givon and Gilgal, so that will help us to understand why it is that, yes, there were times that they were allowed to use bamois, but it's different when you're talking about the time the Mishkan was in Gilgal compared to the time after the Mishkan in Shiloh was destroyed. Why is there that difference? Let's have a look firstly at the halachic definition of a Lashon HaRambam. So the first thing the Rambam says is when they dismantled the three major camps of the Jewish people, and of course the 12 camps of the Shvatim, and they came into Eretz Yisrael. That records the time where they came to establish the Mishkan in Gilgal. The prohibition that had been in place while there was a Mishkan in the desert with the machanos of the Yidden around it, the prohibition against bamos now ceased. And at that point, it became permissible for anybody who wants to use a private altar, exactly as before there had ever been a Mishkan in the desert. In other words, the Het HaKrova is bederech memela. The way the Rambam is describing it, automatically by virtue of the fact that we don't have the setup of the Jewish camp as in the desert, and we haven't yet established the new Jewish homeland, so therefore naturally the prohibition against bamos automatically falls away. The Rambam says, because just as there was life before the establishment of a Jewish camp where you could bring a korban anywhere, we have now gone back to that state because there is no Jewish settlement, and therefore you're allowed to bring a korban anywhere. So, why are there bamos allowed when they come to Gilgal? Because the structure that precludes bamos doesn't exist. Now it's a completely different halachic principle when it comes to allowing bamos after Shiloh is dismantled. That's not a natural process. We actually have to find a basis, a resource in Torah that allows Bamois at that time. We learn from the pasuk that says that Hashem tells us you haven't yet come to menucha, which we already established refers to Shiloh, and nachla, which refers to the Beis Hamikdash. Why does it say two different expressions? From there we learn ela menucha zay Shiloh, nachla zay Yerushalayim. Why does the pasuk split them into two different descriptive terms? From here we learn that the Torah wanted to allow us the possibility of bamois between Shiloh and the Beis Hamikdash. It's not natural. We have to learn it from a pasuk. We have to have a special heter to allow bamois at this time. Why? Because it's not just reverting to how life was. There's now a Jewish settlement and there was a permanent structure. The fact that the Torah is telling us that we have to create a means by which you're allowed to bring bamois between Shiloh and the Beis Hamikdash, that implies to us that by default we would have wanted to think you cannot have a bama after Shiloh before the Beis Hamikdash. That's what this limud comes to negate. Why would we think that? It's not weil the Mishkan is given given or given machnois. It's not because after Shiloh there was a Mishkan in Neuven Givai and there was a settlement. Rather, we would have thought the problem, the issue over here is as mishabou Shiloh. Then when they reached Shiloh and built that Mishkan there, is bottle givern klolus inyan habamos. We would have thought that would have ended the possibility ever of bringing a bama. Und der Uf is the pasuk mechadesh gita heter ben zelose. That's what the pasuk has to indicate to us. Well, you would have thought Shiloh is the end of the age of bamos. Actually, there is a loophole. There is a possibility to have a bama. You can hear this in the language Rashi uses when he comments on the Gemara. How do we know? In other words, where's the source in the Torah that it is permissible to have bamois after Shiloh had been destroyed, implying that the assumption is Shiloh neutralized the possibility of bamois. Now that we have identified that our thinking would have been that the minute there is Shiloh, you may never have a bama ever again, question is, why would you have thought that way? As in Shiloh, it goes back to what we've already mentioned. By building the Mishkan in Shiloh, it created a place, a location of holiness. Remember, the Mishkan in the desert didn't have a location of holiness. So you dismantle that system, and now you're not locked into a specific location anymore, and you can bring an Abama anywhere. But during Gilgal, there's no location yet of holiness, so you can have a Abama anywhere. But Shiloh made a location of holiness. So whether or not that location is viable at the moment, you have negated the possibility of other locations, right? So Hamokim Asher Yivcha Hashem, that's the place Hashem chose. That automatically neutralizes the possibility of alternatives. Now then after the fact, when Shiloh is no longer functional, we need a special derivation from the Torah to allow bamois again, because by rights they should not be allowed because there's a holy place and you should only use that holy place. If that's the case, now we have to distinguish between the holy place called Shiloh and the holy place called the Beis Hamikdash. We need to understand. If it's true that the place Hashem has chosen refers equally to Shiloh, then why is it that only the Beis Hamikdash is given the name Beis HaBechira, which means the place chosen by Hashem? Why don't we use that or a similar expression to describe the Mishkan Shiloh, which the pasuk says is the place Hashem had chosen? Therefore, we must conclude that despite the fact the pasuk designates Shiloh as a place chosen by Hashem, there's a big difference between how Shiloh was chosen and how Yerushalayim or the Beis Hamikdash was chosen. What is that difference? The answer to that lies in our parsha, where there are two different times that the Torah tells us about the responsibility we have to bring a korban in a holy place. One of them will illustrate the nature of Shiloh, the other, the nature of the Beis Hamikdash and how they're fundamentally different. Free state in Pasuk, initially the Pasuk tells us, Lo yisasa kein Hashem elekeichem, don't behave this way towards Hashem. What's das meant, in other words, Kipir Shashi, lahaktir shamayim b'chol mokim, don't offer to Hashem in any place you choose. Rather, you have to go to the place that David has chosen. Seek out Hashem Shechina, come to that place, and bring your korbanos to that place. What's the pasuk telling us? Don't sacrifice anywhere, only sacrifice where Hashem tells you. That's the first pasuk. The next state later on, there's a different pasuk that says, and gomer, you'll cross the yard, and gomer, and the Eibishter will take care of your enemies, and then there will be a place that the Eibishter will choose to place his Shechina. Once he chooses that place, then you bring your korbanos to that place. Very different angle. It's not don't bring, but come here. This is here's the place, come to this place. Sifri and Rashi both point out, as their pasuk is Amale Inyan Shiloh. The first pasuk is referring to Shiloh, and the zweite Amale in Yerushalayim, and the second pasuk referring to the Beis Hamikdash in Yerushalayim, telling us really what the difference between the two of them is. So what's the difference? Well, let's first look at a different nuance in the difference between the two psukim, which will help us as well. In the Mershon pasuk, it says how had Goshefen mentioned. The first pasuk, which we now say refers to Shiloh, is speaking to the person. It's telling us what to do. You have to bring your korbanos to this place. Whereas the second pasuk is emphasizing the location. Shoma, to that place, emphasis. You bring your korbanos. Why that difference between focusing on the person, the practitioner, or the location? That's because there's a very significant difference between the two psukim and their message. In the erste psukim, hoibt on the Torah miten iser. The first psukim, which we say refer to Shiloh, start off with what you may not do. Don't bring a korban just anywhere. Now, if the Torah is telling us there's a prohibition, don't bring a korban anywhere, then it has to tell us, so what's the alternative? So the pasuk says, well, you should only go to the place Hashem has designated. Das meint, in other words, the thrust of this pasuk is, as in when the Eibishter chose this place, which we now know is Shiloh, is mudgash as the mitvet bavontem isu from makriv zayin korbanos b'chol mokem, is aligned with and associated with a prohibition. Don't bring korbanos everywhere else. Therefore, Hashem chooses a place for you. In other words, the fundamental issue is you shouldn't bring a korban anywhere, just anywhere. Therefore, what are we going to do about it? We're going to make a place called Shiloh. Now, blazing ein ort so, to negate the possibility of bringing a korban in the wrong place, we choose the right place, and that's going to be Shiloh. Mashenkin in the zweiten pasuk, the second pasuk comes from a completely different angle, the opposite angle. It's the pasuk starts with what you have to do. The Eibishter is going to choose a place. That's going to be the holy place where the Shechina will be. And as a result of it being a holy place, you have to bring korbanos to that place. But that's the exact opposite. As the it's not that you need a place to bring korbanos because you're not allowed to bring them just anywhere. It's because this is a holy place, therefore you're supposed to bring your korbanos to that place. Therefore, is moving, which helps us to understand. Yes, Shiloh is a place chosen by Hashem. But what Hashem chose about Shiloh is altogether different to what Hashem chose about the Beis Hamikdash. How so? By Shiloh is given the Bechira in the Mokim. With Shiloh, what Hashem chose was this geographical location. And that was no blois v'atitzo from them iser lahaktir l'shamayim b'chol mokim. Why did he choose a geographical location? Because Hashem had already limited us from bringing korbanos in other locations. So therefore he chose a location to bring those karbanos. So to put it into different words, why is there a Shiloh? For a reason. What's the reason? We need a place because we're not allowed to bring a korban in any place we choose. Mashenk in Yerushalayim, Shalayim is a completely different principle. Is das der Ort, was der Eibishter Beuche gewinnt, nicht mitzad hatam. The Eibishter chose Yerushalayim not because of technical reasons we need a place, because the Eibishter loves or prioritizes Yerushalayim. No, as Dosel Zaim Mekem Asheras Shchinasi is Baruch. This is what the Eibishter fundamentally, intrinsically wants the Shechina to be. And because this is the place the Eibishter has chosen to manifest his Shechina, naturally this is the place you bring karbanos. Or to put it differently, besigna nacher. The Bechir in Shiloh is given to Lib Eden. Why did Hashem choose a place of Shiloh? To allow Yidden the possibility, Azazel and Haben, that they could have a place where they could bring karbanos. Because you're not allowed to bring karbanos everywhere, so let's make a place so the Yidden can do this. So it's not willy-nilly all over the place as during the time of Bamos. Is given mitzadem Eibishten kvayochel, but the choice of Yerushalayim as a holy place, that's so to speak the Eibishter's need. As that the Eibishter chose a particular place where he will manifest his Shechina eternally. Oh, and then as a result of that, we bring karbanos to that place. Now that we see that difference between what motivates the choice of Shiloh, practical need, and what motivates the choice of Yerushalayim, this is where the Eibishter wants his Shechina. That clarifies what Hashem chose in each instance. Now that we know that the purpose of choosing Shiloh as a destination for the Shechina is to facilitate bringing karbanos, we need a place where we can bring karbanos. So that's exactly what we need. Choose a place. Here's the location to bring your karbanos. So Mekoim Habayis, the place where Mishkan Shiloh will be, is relevant. The structure itself is actually not so relevant. Mashenkim Yerushalayim is das abchir mitzad atzmo onatama magbil in the minyan. But with Yerushalayim, the Eibishter chooses Yerushalayim because he chooses Yerushalayim, not because he has to choose a place. Is das keil seiden mokem habayis seiden bayis? In that choice, the Eibishter is not only choosing the location, but also the structure that will be in that location. The fact that the Eibishter chose this place for his Shechina forever is moving as the menucha befeil ver durch dem bayis, the bayis guf is a beis habechira. So something happens over here. The house, the structure, the Beis Hamikdash becomes the channel to allow the Shechina into the place. The house is chosen. It's a beis habechira. And you'll see that in the language used by the two psukim. When describing Shiloh, the pasuk tells us it's a place the Eibishter chose, that he will place his name in that location. Whereas Yerushalayim is described as the place the Eibishter has chosen and therefore will manifest his name. The Torah is not highlighting by Shiloh that Hashem chose the place. No, in Losum Eshmoi, he just needed somewhere to place his name to manifest his Shechina. Mashenkim Yerushalayim is the Yivcha Vaylekecho Boy in dem Mokim, whereas the Torah emphasizes that when it comes to Yerushalayim, Hashem has chosen the place. Yerushalayim is now inherently valuable. That's why the Rambam calls this section of halacha that describes the laws of the Beis Hamikdash as the laws of the chosen structure, the chosen home. Even though, look at the beginning of the halachis, Keseres von Hilchos Beis HaBechira, in the headline of Beis HaBechira, where the Rambam always explains what the halachas are about, in the halachas, and he lists which mitzvahs apply in these laws. Sagt der Rambam, the erste mitzvah is livnois Beis Hamikdash and nicht Beis HaBechira. Straight away, the Rambam tells us that the mitzvah is to build a Beis Hamikdash. He doesn't then call it Beis HaBechira. So these are the laws of Beis HaBechira. It's a mitzvah to make a Beis Hamikdash. Sounds a little bit strange. But der Sinn der Halachis Gufa. Same thing in the Halachis. Gleich in der erste Halacha bringt the pasuk Vasuli Mikdash. The first introductory source in Torah that the Rambam uses for the mitzvah to build a Beis HaMikdash calls it a Mikdash. Or not the pasuk, wo steht the lashon from Bechira. He doesn't quote the pasuk V'amokim asher yivchar or something like that. They would highlight the name he's given to these halachas, Beis HaBechira. Not only that, Nachme. Divided the halachas v'shaychas zum Beis HaMikdash. All the subsequent halachas that deal with other details of the Beis HaMikdash. Rufta taka on mit nama Mikdash. He calls those sections Mikdash. Klei HaMikdash, Bias HaMikdash. So why then is the first section called Hilchos Beis HaBechira? Damit is mudgesh as the Ikar Chiddush into Beis Hamikdash Rishalayim, because the Rambam wants to highlight that the great insight and innovation about the Beis Hamikdash is Beis Elamim, is Bechiras HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that the Eibusha chose not only the place but the building to be a permanent structure of holiness. Was das drückt sich euch in dem. Was euch der Beis is a Beis HaBechira, and that of course is highlighted in the fact that not only is the location a chosen location, like Shiloh, but the building is a chosen building, Beis HaBechira. Now let's go back to the expression the Rambam used. Once the Beis HaMikdash was built, it became forbidden to make any other place to sacrifice to Hashem. The L'cha'ira. If it's true that we've pointed out that the big deal of the Beis Hamikdash is it's a place that Hashem has chosen, and then the Rambam should have said, once the Beis Hamikdash was chosen as a place, then it became forbidden to bring elsewhere. Because isn't that the whole point of here, that the Eibusha chose a place? Nochmer, in Mechilta steht Takazei de Lashon. In fact, that's the expression of the Mechilta. That's actually the expression the Mechilta uses. And the Rambam is Mishana from the Shem HaMechilta. And Zakim Shenivne HaMikdash. The Rambam changes the language from what would appear to be his source, the Mechilta, and he talks about once the Beis HaMikdash was built, that's when it is forbidden to bring karbonos elsewhere. Well, now we understand why. There are actually two phases, two elements to the choice of the Beis Hamikdash in Yerushalayim. And they play out in two different periods. First of all, the Eibishter chose the place. That occurred long ago. That occurred at the time of Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. That's why, as the Rambam tells us, this was already a location that Avram identified to build a Mizbeach. It's a place where he offered Yitzchak as an offering. And it's a place where Noach brought an offering, and Adam Arishan, etc. With Rambam is Mevorim Perik Beis, as the Rambam explains. Because initially it is Hamokim Asher Yivchar. On the Bechira in the Beis Kufa, the next step is, in addition to choosing the place, Hara Maria, similar to the fact that the Eibishter chose Shiloh, then the Eibishter also chose the actual Beis HaMikdash. That only comes into play when the Beis HaMikdash is actually built. Which not only realizes the value of the structure, but it elevates the value of the place the structure is on. Now Har HaBayis is even more valuable than it was in the time of Avram and Yitzchak and Noach, etc. That's why it's only from the time the Beis Hamikdash stands on the Har HaBayis that it becomes forbidden to bring a carbon anywhere else. Of course, we know that Avram Avinu brought a carbon on Har HaMoriah, but not only on Har HaMoriah. And that's why you'll see the sources that the Rambam brings to back this up are these psukim. David, Zehu Beis Hashem Hoilikim, V'zeh Mizbech Loile Yisrael. This is the house for the Eibishter and the Mizbech that accompanies it. Was das bringt heraus wie die Bechira is nicht nur im Mekayim HaMikdash, nor in dem Beis Kufa, because the Rambam wants to highlight that it's not only the location that is chosen to be holy and special, but the building on that location that is chosen to be holy and special. And the Eibishter says, this is my permanent place of rest or settlement. Was in dem zweiten Pasuk is musbar der time of dem was die Bechira is im bias. That second pasuk actually helps us appreciate why the Eibishter chose not only the location but the building as well. Because as we've already mentioned, the Eibishter didn't choose Yerushalayim because technically the Jews needed a place to bring a korban, but rather because this is his place. Once we know this is the Eibishter's place, it helps us to appreciate that it's not only the location that is valuable, there has to be the place that houses the Shechina that is key to this place. The Beis Hamikdash is actually the key value. And that goes back to why when the pasuk is describing what you do in Mishkan Shiloh, it says you bring the karbonos there. The Torah opens the discussion with our requirement to bring a korban. And of course it tells us there is a place to which we bring. Whereas when the pasuk describes Yerushalayim, first it talks about the place and then tells us to come to that place because there's a place of holiness, therefore you bring your korban there. The fact that you have to bring a korban during the time of Mishkan Shiloh into Shiloh, that's a personal responsibility. Because the Jewish people have a responsibility to sacrifice. And later the Torah says not only do you sacrifice, but you have to bring into a specific place. So you have a responsibility. It needs a place. Therefore the Eibishter chooses a place, Shiloh. And if there is that place now designated, you may not bring a korban anywhere else. Let's say that a little differently. Because you're not allowed to bring a korban anywhere else, therefore once there's Shiloh, that becomes the place that excludes everywhere else. Whereas Shiloh is not that the Jews need a place to bring a korban, but the Eibishter has selected the ultimate manifestation of Shechina in Yerushalayim, and specifically in a structure, a bias, Beis HaBechira, as the Shloima as the mitzvah akrava dort and hachgiv kol karbonos bebeis habechira is euch mitzadem chefza from korban. Now you realize that the requirement to bring a korban there is not only because you, the person, have to bring a korban in a place, but because the korban can only be brought in that place. But bizayom took the Lashon Rambam in Sefer Hayad by the mitzvah akrava bebeis habechira. That gives us a nice insight into the Rambam's language. Where the Rambam does not begin the laws of bringing karbonos by saying there's a mitzvah to bring a korban. Now, mitzvah karbonos, he switches around. He talks about the korban has to be brought. Mitzvah asay lakriv bebeis habechira. Was therefore is mashal, which implies as the chiv to makriv zayin the karbonos dafka dort, the fact that there's a mitzvah to bring a korban specifically in the Beis Hamikdash is nit nor atnai in oifen akrava mitzadem makriv gavra. It's not just one of the requirements I have as the sacrificer that this is how I have to do it. No, ich mitzad the karbonos chefza. It's actually intrinsic to the korban. The korban can only be a korban in this place. Why is that? Because the Eibishter has chosen a home where his Shechina will be. That home impacts and has an effect on the karbonos, as medavs and makriv zayin in dem bayis, that the only suitable place to bring those karbonos is in the Beis Hamikdash. Mitzvah Hashem, we should have that opportunity. Take kef umiyad mamish.